Welcome, everybody. It is so good to have you here today, whether you're joining us online or attending in person at one of our three locations. Either way, wherever you happen to be right now, I'm so glad that you've taken the time to join us. Today is week number 2 in a teaching series from one of the most fascinating books of the Bible, the book of Jonah. But before I jump into the teaching for today, just a quick reminder. Over the last couple of months, we've been talking about a very important decision in the life of our church. We have the opportunity to join forces with another great church here in Pennsylvania called LCBC Church. And the best way to get more information about this opportunity is to attend a vision meeting. We have 4 of these meetings during the month of May. The next one is this Sunday, May 16th, at the Wilkes-Barre campus. We'll have about 15 staff members from LCBC joining us, and you'll have the opportunity to meet them and find out anything you want to know about LCBC Church. So I hope you'll make time to join us for one of these vision meetings. Again, the next one is this Sunday. If you're watching this message on Sunday, that would be tonight, May 16th, 6 o'clock at the Wilkes-Barre campus. Okay, as I mentioned, today is week number 2 in a 4-week teaching series on one book of the Bible, the book of Jonah. And the book of Jonah is one of those parts of the Bible that even if you're not a church person, you at least know bits and pieces of the story. And when you hear the word Jonah, you might think, oh yeah, I know that story. That's the story about the big fish. But the book of Jonah really isn't about a fish. There is a fish in the story, but that's not the point of the story. The story of Jonah is a story about people who are running from God, and a story about the God who loves them so much that he will pursue them even to the ends of the earth. That's why we've entitled this series Amazing Grace, because the story of Jonah is really a story about God's relentless grace. And as strange as the story of Jonah might sound to some people, it really is your story and it's my story, because all of us at one time or another have tried to run from God. Some of you listening to me today would look back and say that you spent a good part of your life running from God, or at least walking in the opposite direction, and maybe it's only recently that you've turned around. For others of you watching this message, it's not that you're running from God in a general sense, but you're running from God in one specific area of your life. Maybe there's one particular issue where you've just been saying, God, you just need to stay out of that part of my life. Maybe God is calling you to do something or to say something or to let go of something, and you just keep saying, nope, not going to do it. And so in that one area of your life, you're running from God. And here's what we discovered last week from the story of Jonah, that you can run from God, but you can't outrun God. No matter how far we try to run from God, he keeps coming after us, he keeps pursuing us, and that, my friends, is a good thing. Well, today, as we continue this series, I want to answer this question. What do you do when you've run out of room to run? What do you do when you've hit rock bottom and you're facing the pain that comes from the choices you've made? What do you do when you're flat on your back emotionally or spiritually? That's what we're going to talk about today as we pick up the story of Jonah in Jonah chapter 2. But before we jump in, let me do a little bit of review for those of you who missed last week, Jonah chapter 1. So Jonah, as many of you know, Jonah was a Jewish prophet, and he had been given a very difficult assignment. He was told to go to Nineveh and warn the people of that city that God's judgment was about to fall, that they would have one last opportunity to change their ways, because God is a God of grace. Now, Nineveh was the capital city of the Assyrian Empire. And the Assyrians were the most powerful nation in the world at that time. And they were a constant threat to their neighbors, the nation of Israel. The Assyrians, and this is a well-documented fact of history, the Assyrians were very cruel and very violent people. And the people of Israel were often the target of that cruelty and that violence, which means that Jonah probably knew people who were killed by the Assyrians, and he probably carried some personal bitterness toward the people of Nineveh. But see, God was not ready to give up on the people of Nineveh, and he says, Jonah, I want you to go there and give them one more warning. I want you to tell them of my grace for sinners. And to really understand what that would be like, imagine God sending a Jew into Germany in 1940 to preach the love and forgiveness of God to Hitler and the SS. I mean, this was not an easy assignment. And Jonah wanted nothing to do with it. And so here's what Jonah does. Jonah chapter 1, verse 3. Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. Now, to really understand this, let me show you what it looks like on Google Maps again. To go to Nineveh, Jonah had to travel on land about 500 miles to the northeast. But here's what Jonah did instead. He went 2,500 miles in the opposite direction. This was literally as far as you could go in those days in terms of commercial shipping routes. So in effect, Jonah was saying, not only am I not going to go to Nineveh, I am in fact going to go as far as I possibly can in the other direction. But here's the good news. God doesn't give up on us that easily. God loved Jonah too much to just let him run. So here's where we left off last week, verse 17. But the Lord provided a great fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was inside the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Now, I know that some of you may have a hard time believing this part of the story, the whole fish swallows man thing. I get that. I won't take the time to explain it now, but go back and watch last week's message where I addressed that question and why I really have no issue with reading that. So anyway, Jonah finds himself in the belly of a great fish, and it was there in that terrible place that his heart began to change. And today we come to chapter 2. Jonah chapter 2 is really a prayer. Jonah basically wrote a journal about his experience inside that fish. He looks back on what he was thinking and what he was praying, and he summarizes it in this really beautiful, succinct prayer. It's only 10 verses long, but it has a very powerful message for us today. And here's the lesson that I hope we can learn today from Jonah chapter 2. It's this: God doesn't want to pay you back. He wants to bring you back. God isn't interested in paying you back. He wants to bring you back. And maybe you've been running from God, and now you're feeling the consequences of the choices you've made, and your life has gotten painful. But the reason why God has allowed you to experience that pain is not to pay you back, but to win you back. A few years ago, there was an interesting story in the news about a stolen car in California. And the police were searching frantically for this stolen car, even to the point where they put announcements on local radio stations to try to get in touch with the carjacker. And there was a reason why they were so intent on finding this stolen car, and it was this. On the front seat of that car was a box of crackers, and those crackers were laced with rat poison. You see, the owner of the car was planning to use the crackers as bait to deal with a rat problem at a property he owned. But while he was driving there, he stopped to get gas, and his car was stolen. And so the police wanted to catch this car thief, not so they could just punish him, but so that they could save him. And see, the reason we run from God is because we think He is out to make our lives miserable, when in fact, all He wants to do is rescue us. God doesn't want to pay you back. He wants to bring you back. And I think that's the theme of Jonah chapter 2. So let's look at Jonah chapter 2 and talk about 3 things that I think any of us need to do when we come to that point where we hit rock bottom. So when you've hit rock bottom, the first thing to do is this, and that is to look up. Just look up. Let me begin with verse 1 of chapter 2. It says, "From inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. He said, 'In my distress I called to the Lord.'" And let me just stop right there, because Jonah here is describing something that is so typical of our prideful human nature. In my distress I called to the Lord. I mean, isn't that what we all do? Isn't that what it takes sometimes for us to call out to God? For some of you, the first time you prayed in a long time was in your distress. You were staring at a pregnancy test. You were in the back seat of a police car. You were driving home to tell your parents something that you knew would break their hearts. In your distress, you called out to the Lord. Sometimes that's what it takes. But here's the amazing thing. Let me go back and read that again. From inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. He said, in my distress, I called out to the Lord, and here's the great part, and he answered me. From deep in the realm of the dead, I called for help, and you, God, listened to my cry. And so the first thing we learn from this prayer of Jonah is this, that when we finally stop running from God and we decide to turn around, he will be there. When we finally decide to call out to him, he will answer. He will listen. In fact, let me go back and read verse 2 again, and let me insert a phrase of my own in the middle of it. In my distress that I brought upon myself, I called to the Lord, and he answered me. You see, God listens to the desperate cry of help from desperate people who are in desperate circumstances, even of their own making. And that's amazing. That's amazing grace. Even if you've been running from God for years, and even if there's no one to blame but you, when you finally hit rock bottom and turn back in God's direction, he is there and he will listen. We have this phrase that we use sometimes. When you're waiting for someone to come home and you're not sure when they might show up, we just say, well, I'll leave the light on for you. Like Tom Bodett, Motel 6, will leave the light on for you. About 25 years ago, there was a country song by Trace Adkins. It was a song about waiting for the girl he loved to change her mind and turn around and come back to him. And the song lyrics go like this. Every light in the house is on. The backyard's bright as the crack of dawn. The front walk looks like runway lights. It's kind of like noon in the dead of night. Every light in the house is on just in case you ever do get tired of being gone. Every light in the house is on. And my friend, I don't care who you are or how far you may have run in the wrong direction. You have a Father in heaven who leaves the light on for you. When you hit rock bottom and call out to him, he will hear and he will listen. Now, let me tell you why it's so important to get this. Because not knowing this may cause you to not turn back to God. Because you might be tempted to think, you know what, I've blown it too badly. I've run too far. It's too late for me. So I'm just going to keep running as far as I can and as fast as I can, because what other option do I have? God can never forgive me at this point. If that's how you feel today, or if that's how you have ever felt, I want you to hear the voice of God speaking to you through the story of Jonah and saying to you, it's not too late. You're not too far gone. Call out to me and I will listen. So, when you hit rock bottom, look up. The second thing that we need to do when we hit rock bottom in our lives is to look back. That's what Jonah does in the next section here. In verses 3 through 7, Jonah looks back on what had happened to him. And as he looks back on this whole ordeal, he recognizes something. He recognizes that God was right there the whole time. That even though he had tried to run from God, God never gave up on him. Look at verse 3. It says, you hurled me into the depths, into the very heart of the seas, and the currents swirled about me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. Now, you read that, and you might think, wait a minute, time out, Jonah. God didn't throw you into the sea. The sailors did that. Don't you remember your own story? You see, Jonah knew that it was the sailors who physically picked him up and threw him in. But there's something else Jonah realized. Looking back, he realized that God was right there in the middle of his mess, trying to get his attention. Look at the next couple of verses here. Jonah goes on to describe his own experience, just how bad things got. I said, I've been banished from your sight, yet I will look again toward your holy temple. And then he goes on to describe what happened. The engulfing waters threatened me. The deep surrounded me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. To the roots of the mountains I sank down. The earth beneath barred me in forever. But you, Lord my God, brought my life up from the pit. What's being described here in these verses is a near-death experience. That Jonah was actually sinking to the bottom of the sea, like holding his breath, seaweed wrapped around his head. And then just before Jonah is about to drown, he gets swallowed up by a fish. And think about what this must have felt like for Jonah. Oh no, I'm going to drown. Oh good, I'm saved. Oh no, I'm inside a fish. What an experience. Here's my question. Why did God allow Jonah to go through all that? Why not just send an angel to lift him out of the water immediately after he goes in? Why not have a big piece of driftwood floating nearby? Why did God allow him to get right to the brink of death? Keep on reading, because I think there's a clue in the next verse, verse 7. He says, when my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord, and my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple. Did you catch that? When my life was ebbing away, I remembered you. That's when my prayer rose to you. Like Jonah gets to the point of absolute desperation before he finally prays. And you know what I've discovered? That's what it takes, unfortunately, for a lot of people. I know people who, God never got their attention until they were staring at a broken marriage, or it took a bad accident, or a serious health issue, or a lost job before, they remembered God and turned to Him. Sometimes it isn't until life falls apart around us that we really see the hopelessness of life apart from God. And listen, God loves us so much that He will let us reach rock bottom. He will let us get to the very end of ourselves. And here's what you discover when you stop running and look back. You discover that all the pain you went through when you were running from God, that was the very thing that God used to get your attention, not to pay you back, but to bring you back. There's a short passage of scripture in the New Testament in Romans chapter 8, may be very familiar to you. Romans chapter 8, beginning in verse 28, it says, and we know that in all things, and I would insert this, we know that in all things, even painful things, even the consequences of our own dumb choices, in all things, God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. For those God foreknew, He also predestined to be conformed to the image of His Son. That God uses even the pain in our lives to make us more like His Son, Jesus Christ. I'm a dad of two girls. And as a father, there were many times when we were raising our kids that I would allow my kids to feel some pain. I didn't try to shield them from every hurt that came their way. In fact, there were times when I was the one who was bringing the pain into their lives in the form of chores or homework or sometimes punishment. Now, let me ask you a question. Was I a bad parent because I allowed pain into the lives of my kids? No. That makes me a good parent. A bad parent is the parent who tries to protect their kids from any kind of pain, because then you end up raising a child who is lacking in character. And God is a perfect parent. And there are times when He allows pain in our lives, especially when it's the pain that comes as a consequence of our own choices. He uses that to help us grow up, to deepen our faith, to strengthen our character. And whenever I think about pain and suffering and how God can use it in our lives, I always think about a statue in Alabama. There's this statue that stands in the town square in the little town of Enterprise, Alabama. And it's a statue of a woman who looks like she might be related to the woman in the Statue of Liberty. She's holding above her head an enormous black bug, though. It looks like a cockroach. Actually, it's a boll weevil. And that's why this is called the Boll Weevil Monument in Enterprise, Alabama. Obviously, there's a story behind this. In the early 1900s, the entire economy of Enterprise, Alabama was very dependent on cotton. Most of the people in that town made their living by growing and selling cotton. But then disaster struck. For 3 consecutive years, the boll weevil infested their cotton and completely destroyed the crops and almost destroyed the town economically. So the people of Enterprise took a risk. They decided to give up growing cotton and started growing a crop that was fairly new in the United States, something called peanuts. And within just a few years, they were making far more money growing peanuts than they had ever made growing cotton. And so as a way of remembering this hardship and what it brought about in their lives, they built this statue in the town square in 1919. And there's a plaque on the statue that says this: "In profound appreciation for the boll weevil and what it has done as the herald of prosperity." See, what they originally thought was their greatest problem actually turned out to be the one thing that brought them the greatest benefit. And the truth is, we all have boll weevil experiences in life. Those times when something comes into your life that is difficult or disappointing or downright painful. And God will take those experiences and use them to accomplish His good purpose in our lives. Because sometimes we have to feel some pain before God gets our full attention. C.S. Lewis, in his book, The Problem of Pain, says it really well. He says, "Pain plants the flag of truth within the fortress of a rebel soul." And my friend, the pain that you're going through right now, that may be God's grace in your life. Perhaps He allowed that pain not to pay you back, but to bring you back. So when you hit rock bottom, number one, look up and recognize God is ready to forgive. And then look back and realize and rejoice in what has brought you to this point. But then number 3, when you hit rock bottom, look ahead. Look ahead to a new beginning and a fresh start. So Jonah thinks about all that he's been through. And then he realizes in this moment how foolish it was to turn from God in the first place. Look at what he says in verse 8. This is like my favorite verse in this whole book of the Bible. He says, "Those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them." And by the way, this really is the key verse in the book of Jonah. It is right smack dab in the middle of the book. 24 verses come before this one, 23 verses after it. And this single verse is really the theme of the book of Jonah. So let me spend just a couple of minutes unpacking this. Jonah talks here about those who cling to worthless idols. And, you know, the topic of idolatry, I don't know if you know this or not, it's one of the most prominent themes in the Bible. It's mentioned over 1,000 times. But when we talk about idols or idolatry, most of us think just of ancient people in ancient times bowing down to little statues of stone and wood. And we say, you know, I'm sure that was a problem like hundreds of years ago. But it's not a problem for me because, see, I live in the 21st century. We're smart. We're sophisticated. We don't worship idols. But here's the truth. An idol is anything you look to and depend on to give you what only God can give. The Christian philosopher Peter Kreeft put it this way. He said, "The opposite of theism or belief in God is not atheism. It is idolatry. Because we all are wired to worship something. We all try to find meaning in something. And here's the thing about running from God. Whenever you run from God, it's because you're running to something else. You're running to someone, or you're running to an opportunity, or you're running to a lifestyle, or you're running to pleasure, or you're running to the approval of others. And when you run from God, you always run to something. And here's what Jonah is saying here. He's saying everyone who runs from God comes to the place where they finally get what it is they were running after. And then they realize that what they have given their time to and their energy to and given their heart to is not what they thought it was. And they realize that what they pursued is not worth what they had to give up in the process. And Jonah, he looks back on what had happened to him. And in the belly of that fish, he realizes something. He says, I have traded the experience of God's love for a worthless idol, the idol of my comfort, the idol of my pride, the idol of my hatred. And in choosing those idols, I've turned my back on God's love. And now his heart is changing. So he goes on to say this. He continues, "But I, with shouts of grateful praise, will sacrifice to you, God. What I have vowed, I will make good. I will say, salvation comes from the Lord." In other words, I will go to Nineveh and tell the people of Nineveh, salvation comes from the Lord. So finally, Jonah is ready to go where God is calling him to go. He is ready to surrender to God's will. And then we come to the very last sentence in chapter 2. Here's how this chapter ends. Verse 10, "And the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land," which just goes to show you that you can't keep a good man down. See, this is a picture of grace. God had given Jonah another shot at life. He didn't die there in the belly of that fish. God allowed him to live. He rescued Jonah from Jonah's own stubbornness. And that in itself was a gift. And if you didn't know the rest of the story, you might think that might be the end of the story. You might expect God to say, "Okay, Jonah, you can go home now. I mean, I'm glad you repented and everything, but I found someone else to go to Nineveh because I can't trust you. So I'm just going to put you on the bench and put somebody else in the game." You know, that's what we might expect. But that's not what happens. Let me look ahead to the first 2 verses in chapter 3. It says this, "Then the word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time. Go to the great city of Nineveh and proclaim to it the message I give you." See, it's one thing to preserve his life, but then to turn around and give him another chance, I mean, that's grace. That's amazing grace. I have a book here with me by Greg Laurie called The God of the Second Chance. Let me just read a couple of paragraphs. Kind of a goofy story, but it makes a good point. He writes this, "I heard a story about a man whose name was mistakenly printed in the obituary column of his local newspaper. Not amused, the man got into his car, drove down to the newspaper office, and demanded to see the editor. The editor came out and said, 'Yes, sir, can I help you?' 'I'm outraged,' the man said. 'You printed my name in the obituary column. As you can see, I am alive and well. This will be a great embarrassment to me. I will probably even lose business.' 'Sir, I'm very sorry,' said the editor. 'It was an error, but there is nothing I can do.' The man continued to rant and rave and even threatened to sue the newspaper. Finally, the editor said, 'I'll tell you what I can do. Tomorrow, I'll put your name in the birth column and give you a fresh start.'" You know, in spite of Jonah's disobedience and his stubbornness, you know what he got? He got a fresh start. He got a second chance. Because God is a God of second chances. He is a God of grace. Now, I don't know where you find yourself today. Some of you hearing this message would admit that you've been running from God. And you know, whenever we run from God, our lives always get more complicated and more painful. Because when you run from God, you turn your back on God, which means turning your back on the ultimate source of wisdom and truth. And whenever we turn our back on God's wisdom, we end up doing things that just create a lot of pain for ourselves and for the people around us. And maybe God has allowed you to feel that pain, not because He wants to pay you back, but because He wants to win you back. And if you ever doubt that, just look at a blood-stained Roman cross. Because 750 years after Jonah, God stepped into this world, took on human flesh, and went to a cross to pay the price for your sin and my sin, for your rebellion and my rebellion. The Bible says it this way: He Himself bore our sins in His body on the cross so that we might die to sins and live for righteousness. By His wounds you have been healed. For you were like sheep going astray, but now you have returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. See, at the cross, punishment was dealt with. Payback was dealt with. And because our Savior was willing to go to a cross and take out that punishment upon Himself, now, if there's pain in your life, that's not God paying you back. That was taken care of at the cross. But it may be God trying to win you back. And if you find yourself there, look up, look back, and look ahead. My friend, is God speaking to you today? And will you listen before the pain gets any worse? Will you stop running? Will you turn around and surrender to the God who's a God of second chances, a God of grace?